As you read Art History for Dummies, you'll journey around the world and travel back in time. Reading many of the chapters is like going on a vacation to an exotic land in a past life. You can hobnob with a Byzantine empress or an Egyptian pharaoh, attend the ancient Olympics, or stroll through the Ishtar Gate in ancient Babylon. Why do some people study art history and others don't? Probably because high schools don't often teach art history and colleges usually offer it as an elective, unless you're an art major. But art history is the visual side of history, they're sister subjects. Studying art history and history together is like adding pictures to text. It makes the overall story clearer and more interesting. In Art History for Dummies, I often splice history and art history together, giving you a context for the art. Some people believe art history is a highbrow subject. With all those Italian and French terms, it just has to be snobby, right? I disagree. I believe art history is an everyman everywoman subject because it's about mankind's common cultural heritage. Art history mirrors human evolution. It shows mankind through the ages, from cave to castle, jungle hut to urban high-rise. Each age for the last 30,000 years has left an imprint of itself in its art. About this book. In this book, I'm your tour guide through the world of art history. The tour features the greatest art and architecture ever created. On the journey, I point out the key features of these works and structures. Often, I suggest possible interpretations that I hope inspire you to make your own interpretations. I also add spicy anecdotes and colorful facts to make every stop on the tour fun. This book is a reference, it's something you can turn to again and again, dipping into it to find whatever piece of information is most critical to you at the time. You don't have to read it cover to cover. Use the table of contents and index to find the subjects that you're interested in and go from there. Of course, if you want to start with Chapter 1 and read through to the end, you can. But it isn't a requirement to understand the information in these pages. Conventions used in this book. The conventions used in this book are pretty straightforward. When I introduce new terms, I put them in italics and define them in context. I put email addresses and web addresses in monofont so you can spot them more easily and know exactly what to type. When this book was printed, some web addresses may have needed to break across 2 lines of text. If that happened, rest assured that I haven't put in any extra characters to indicate the break. So, when using one of these web addresses, just type in exactly what you see in this book, pretending as though the line break doesn't exist. What you're not to read. Here's a novel idea: don't read anything you're not interested in. If you think Egyptian tombs are dreary, or if postmodernism makes you dizzy, skip those subjects. You don't have to remember everything you read either. After all, I'm not testing you on any of this. You can also skip anything in a sidebar, a gray box of text, without missing the meat of what I'm covering. Sidebars often have interesting information, but they aren't essential to the topic at hand. Foolish assumptions. You don't need to have taken remedial art history or even studied high school art to understand and benefit from this book. This is Art History 101 and there are no prerequisites. I assume you've at least heard of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa and Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel ceiling. But if you haven't, it's no biggie, you have now. You don't need any background in art history or art. I give you the background you need as I go along. I also assume that anything with the word history attached to it may scare you. It conjures up visions of memorizing dates and isms in high school. That's okay. I give some dates and define some isms, but I don't dwell on that side of art history. I prefer to get into the fun stuff. Instead of putting dates and isms in the foreground of the subject, in this book I put the story of art front and center. Bottom line, you won't have to memorize dates. In fact, you won't have to memorize anything. How this book is organized. I break the chapters of Art History for Dummies into parts, described in the following sections. Part 1, Mankind in the Looking Glass, Art History 101. Chapter 1 helps you decide which chapters you want to read first and which chapters you may want to skip, at least for the time being. I've arranged the chapters in chronological order. But you don't have to follow that order. You can jump from surrealism to cave art if you like, or from the Renaissance to Impressionism. In this part, I also introduce you to the tools and art concepts that will help you navigate this book and the world of art and art history. These tools and concepts include comparing and contrasting, looking at balance and pattern, reading visual narrative, sorting out symbolism, and figuring out the artist's intention. Finally, in Chapter 3, I give you a quick rundown of the major art periods and movements, from prehistoric art to postmodernism and everything in between. You may want to periodically refer back to this chapter as a quick reference to see how the periods fit together and influence each other. Part 2, From Caves to Colosseum, Ancient Art. In this part, I look at Stone Age art and its roots in ritual and primitive religion. Next, I examine the religious and political art of the first civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Then I explore ancient Minoan and Greek vase and mural painting, sculpture, and architecture and tell you how Greek culture laid the foundation for the modern world. I show you how Etruscan and Roman art are in some ways outgrowths of Greek art. In my coverage of Roman art, I explain how closely art, architecture, and politics can be interwoven. Part 3, Art after the Fall of Rome, AD 500, AD 1760. Classical art tumbled with Rome in AD 476. New religious-centered art styles emerged in both Europe and Asia. In this part, I examine the glittering Byzantine art of the Eastern Roman Empire, early Christian art in Europe, and Islamic art. I follow the evolution of religious art in Europe during the Middle Ages, focusing on manuscript illuminations, relief sculpture, architecture, tapestries, and painting. Then I explore the rebirth of classical art during the Renaissance and the art traditions that grew out of this rebirth, Mannerism, Baroque, and Rococo. Part 4, The Industrial Revolution and Artistic Devolution, 1760-1900. The Industrial Revolution transformed the world, and the way artists viewed and depicted it. In this part, I show you how some artists tried to rewind the clock. Their art was a graceful throwback to classicism. Some grounded themselves in the glories of unsullied nature, while others soared beyond the stench of industrial mills on the wings of their imaginations. The Industrial Revolution also jump-started sweeping political turnovers like the American and French Revolutions. I show you how romantic and realistic art reflected and often encouraged independence movements, democracy, and social change. Part 5, 20th Century Art and Beyond. In the 20th century, art fanned out in so many directions, it can be hard to track all of them. But I do exactly that in this part. World War I, World War II, and the Vietnam War all had enormous impacts on artists who lived through those catastrophes. In this part, I show you how war spawned arts movements, the goals of which were sometimes the betterment of mankind. I also show you how artists struggled to reflect an increasingly complex world and how they used technology to give their art added horsepower. Finally, I explore early photography and identify how the pioneers of photography slowly learned to focus their art. Part 6, The Part of Tens. The Part of Tens, a feature of every For Dummies book, is a place to go when you're short on time but craving information. In this part, I provide a list of 10 must-see art museums. I briefly describe the museum's collections and highlight a few of the most celebrated works. I also recommend 10 great art books penned by 10 great artists. I strongly recommend you pick up one of these books to discover what the artists themselves thought about their art and life in general. If you're a student, you can use any of these books to write a report on the artist-author. If you're not a student, the books will simply enrich and inspire you. Finally, I introduce you to 10 revolutions in tastes that began on the tips of paintbrushes. Some of these revolutions were short-lived, like Seurat's pointillism movement, others were highly influential. I fill you in here. Appendix. I couldn't fit in this book every piece of art that I wanted to discuss, so I've included an appendix that lists many of these pieces and the websites where you can go to see them. As always, web addresses are subject to change. The addresses are current as of this writing, but if a page has moved, you can use your favorite search engine to track it down. Icons used in this book. This book uses icons in the margins, designed to flag your attention for a particular reason. Here's what each icon means. When I have a little artsy gossip to share with you, I use the anecdote icon. Think of these as the art history for dummies version of the true Hollywood story. Paragraphs marked with the contrast icon tell you to compare or contrast one piece of art with another, to reveal something interesting about both. This icon is like a nudge in the ribs reminding you to file away information for future use. When I give you more information than you really need, I mark it with a technical stuff icon. This is interesting stuff, but if you just want to know what you need to know, you can skip it. The technique icon lets you know that the paragraph to its right covers technique, how the artist made that piece of art. Paragraphs marked with the tip icon offer suggestions for unraveling complicated images and making your review of art history easier and more fun. Where to go from here? You can dive into this book anywhere you like. I've organized art history for dummies so that you can read it in two ways. You can take the full tour and read the book chronologically from cover to cover. This is a great way to see how art evolved over the millennia. You can jump into any chapter or section within a chapter, extract the information you need, and skip the rest. For example, if you're planning to see an Egyptian exhibition or you're taking a test on the period, Chapter 6 will give you all the information you need to ace the test or enjoy the show. If you don't begin at the beginning, I recommend starting with the chapter that covers the art you like best. If it's Michelangelo and Leonardo, start with Chapter 11 on the early and high Renaissance. If it's Frida Kahlo, start with Chapter 23, which includes Surrealism and other movements. Then fan out from there. Each period or movement will lead you to the periods that it grew out of and that grew out of it, giving you a better understanding of why Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, or Frida Kahlo painted as they did. Finally, if you have questions or comments about this book, you can email me at jessebryantwilder@hotmail.com. Part 1. Mankind in the Looking Glass, Art History 101. In this part, I tell you what art history is, why people have made art almost non-stop throughout the ages, and how to look at art. You see why art history is worth studying. And you see what separates art history from history, and what connects them. I end the part with brief, useful descriptions of all the art periods and movements. Chapter 1. Art Tour Through the Ages. In this chapter, understanding the difference between art history and plain, old history. Recognizing the importance of art from prehistoric times to the present. Why study art history rather than music history, literary history, or the history of the postage stamp? Art history, which begins around 30,000 BC with the earliest known cave paintings, predates writing by about 26,500 years. That makes art history even older than history, which begins with the birth of script around 3500 BC. Along with archaeology, art history is one of our primary windows into prehistory. Cave paintings, prehistoric sculpture, and architecture together paint a vivid, although incomplete, picture of Stone Age and Bronze Age life. Without art history, we would know a lot less about our early ancestors. Okay, but what do you need art history for after the historical period kicks in around 3500 BC? History is the diary of the past, ancient peoples writing about themselves combined with our interpretation of what they say. Art history is the mirror of the past. It shows us who we were, instead of telling us, as history does. Just as home movies document a family's history, art history is the home movie of the entire human family through the ages. History is the study of wars and conquests, mass migrations, and political and social experiments. Art history is a portrait of man's inner life, his aspirations and inspirations, his hopes and fears, his spirituality and sense of self. That's ancient history, so why dig it up? If we know who we were 10,000 years ago, we have a better sense of who we are today. Even studying a few ancient Greek vases can reveal a lot about modern society, if you know how to look at and read the vases. Many Greek vases show us what ancient Greek theater looked like. Modern theater and cinema are the direct descendants of Greek theater. Greek vases depict early musical instruments, dancers dancing, and athletes competing in the ancient Olympics, the forerunner of the modern Olympic Games. Some vases show us the role of women and men. Women carry vases called hydrias, men paint those vases. Ancient art teaches us about past religions and the horrors of ancient warcraft. Ramesses II's monument celebrating his battle against the Hittites and Trajan's column, which depicts the Emperor Trajan's conquest of Dacia, are enduring eyewitness accounts of ancient battles that shaped nations and determined the languages we speak today. Art isn't just limited to paintings and sculptures. Architecture, another form of art, reveals the way men and women responded to and survived in their environment, as well as how they defined and defended themselves. Did they build impregnable walls around their cities? Did they raise monuments to their own egos like the female pharaoh Hatshepsut and the vainglorious Ramesses II? Did they erect temples to honor their gods or celebrate the glory of their civilizations like the Greeks? Or did they show off their power through architecture to intimidate their enemies like the Romans? Did the art world crash when Rome fell, or did it just switch directions? Art definitely changed course with the exponential rise of Christianity during the last phase of the Roman Empire. Throughout the Middle Ages, art and architecture had a spiritual mission, to direct man's attention toward God. Churches soared in that direction, and sculpture and paintings pointed the way to paradise. They depicted the sufferings of Christ, the apostles, martyrs, the Last Judgment, and so on. Man's physical features mattered less to medieval artists than his spiritual struggles and aspirations. So they tended to represent man more symbolically than realistically. In Byzantium, religious art had the double role of celebrating the Orthodox Church and the Eastern Roman Empire, which endured until 1453. The Islamic world channeled much of its creative energy into architecture and decorative splendor that has never been surpassed. During the Renaissance, man's spiritual focus shifted again. You could say that Renaissance man had a double vision. He wore spiritual bifocals so that he could see close up and far away. With this double vision, Renaissance artists celebrated both man and God without shortchanging either. The close-up focus allowed realism to make the comeback we call the Renaissance, man reclaiming his classical heritage. The Reformation split Christianity down the middle, unleashing a maelstrom of religious wars between Catholics and Protestants and nearly 200 years of intolerance. To recover what lost ground she could, the Catholic Church launched the Counter-Reformation in the middle of the 16th century. One of the weapons the Church used was religious art that reaffirmed Catholic values while rendering them more people-friendly. Baroque saints shed the idealistic luster they had during the Renaissance and began to look like working-class folk, the class the Church was trying to hold on to. Baroque art and architecture are characterized by grandiose decoration, dramatic lighting, and theatrical gestures that seem to reach out to viewers, mixed with earthy realism. In the Machine Age, where did art get its power? Many 18th and 19th century artists rejected, criticized, or ignored the Industrial Revolution. Instead of uplifting man, industry seemed to demoralize and dehumanize him. Men, women, and children were forced to work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week in urban factories, without benefits or vacations. Factories polluted the cities, alienated man from the soil, and seemed to benefit only those who owned them. This led many artists to turn to nature or the past or to a make-believe golden age when life was beautiful and just. It provoked others to try to reform society through their art. Neoclassical artists didn't paint factories or the urban poor, and they didn't celebrate the upside of the Industrial Revolution, the wider availability of products. Instead, neoclassicism looked back to the pure air and refined beauty of the classical era. Often, artists dressed contemporary heroes in Roman togas and posed them like Olympians. In neoclassical art, no one sweats or strains, no one's hair is ever mussed, and everything is tame, elegant, and orderly. The Romantics believed in individual liberty and the rights of man. They supported and actively encouraged democratic movements and social justice. They opposed slavery and the exploitation of labor in urban factories. Freedom, liberty, and imagination were their favorite words, and some were willing to die for these ideals. Many romantics tried to reform man by emphasizing his spiritual kinship with nature. Others sought a spiritual communion with the divine through their imaginations. Romanticism is an art of intense emotions and passion that exalts individual freedom, while facing off with the infinite and even with death. The next generation of artists, the realists, tried to elevate middle and upper class consciousness regarding the struggles of the poor by illustrating them plainly and honestly. The invention of tin tubes for oil paint in 1841 enabled these artists to paint outdoors, capturing laborers on canvas while they worked. Impressionist painters tried to capture on canvas fleeting moments and the changing effects of light. Their rapid brushstrokes give their work a fuzzy, slightly out-of-focus look. In the 1870s, people thought their paintings looked unfinished, or that the artists needed glasses. Today Impressionism is the most popular style from all of art history. The Post-Impressionists didn't have one guiding vision like the Impressionists. In fact, each Post-Impressionist had his own artistic philosophy. Van Gogh pursued a universal life force behind all things, Gauguin tracked primitive emotions and that noble savage all the way to Tahiti, Cézanne painted the geometrical building blocks of nature, and Ensor unmasked society by giving everyone a mask. The modern world and the shattered mirror. By the beginning of the 20th century, the camera seemed to have a monopoly on realism. That may be one reason painters turned increasingly toward abstraction. But it's not the only reason. Following Cézanne's example, many artists strove to simplify form into its geometrical components. That goal was partly the impetus for Cubism. The Fauve expressed emotion with color, and the Expressionists did the same thing by distorting form. World War I slammed the door on the past for a lot of artists because the old order had caused the war, the worst in history. The so-called anti-art movement, Dada, was a direct reaction to World War I. If war was rational, artists would be irrational. Sigmund Freud's theories of the role of the unconscious inspired the Surrealists to paint their dreams and coax the unconscious to the surface so they could channel it into their art. Einstein's theory of relativity stimulated the Futurists to include the fourth dimension, time, in their work. Horrendous acts of injustice during the global depression of the 1930s, racism, and World War II fired up many artists, especially photographers, to create activist art. New technology enabled photographers to capture people quickly and discreetly, showing life more honestly or more unposed than ever before. The cameras of pioneering photojournalists like Henri Cartier-Bresson, Dorothea Lange, and Margaret Bourke-White zoomed in on urban life, poverty, and war, and showed the entire world grim realities that had previously been swept under the carpet. After the Holocaust and Hiroshima, mankind seemed overdue for an appointment on the psychoanalyst's couch. That's exactly where some artists and thinkers went. Psychoanalysis inspired one post-war American artist to pioneer abstract expressionism, the first influential and imitated American art movement. Jackson Pollock's abstract expressionist works look like he dropped the big one on each of his canvases, or at least a paint bomb. Actually, he just dripped, poured, and threw paint at his canvases instead of slathering it on with a brush. Pollock's and de Kooning's action painting, as dripping and throwing paint came to be called, signaled that art had moved away from craft toward pure expression and creative conceptualization. Many new forms of art grew out of the notion that process is more important than product. Craft had been the cornerstone of art for millennia. But after the war, Pollock and de Kooning seemed to drop an atom bomb on art itself, to release its pure creative energy. Conceptualization began to drive the work of more and more artists. However, while this trend continued in performance art, installation art, and conceptual art, some artists backtracked to representation. The photorealists, for example, showed that painting could reclaim realism from the camera. Postmodernism is an odd term. It suggests that we've hit a cultural dead end, that we've run out of ideas and can't make anything new or modern. All that's left is to recycle the past or crab-leg it back to the cave days. Postmodern artists do recycle the past, usually in layers: a quart of Greece, a cup of constructivism, a pound of Bauhaus, and a heaping tablespoon of modernism. What's the point of that? Postmodern theorists believe that society is no longer centered. In the Middle Ages, art revolved around religion. In the 19th century, realist art centered around social reform, and surrealism dove into dreams and the unconscious. But since the 1970s, point of view has become fluid. Even the political left and right get mixed up sometimes. To express our uncentered or ungrounded existence, artists try to show the relationships between past eras and the present. Some critics argue that postmodernism is a spiritual short circuit, a jaded view that separates meaning from life. You be the judge. Chapter 2. Why people make art and what it all means. In this chapter, exploring the reasons artists make art, understanding the elements of art, decrypting those deep meanings. Art is a sometimes mysterious form of communication. What did so-and-so mean to convey when he or she carved a stone into a fat fertility goddess or a fractured geometric shape? In this chapter, I help you demystify the visual language that we call art. Focusing on the artist's purpose. Why do artists make art? To celebrate God, glorify the state, overthrow governments, make people think, or to win fame and fortune? Or do they make art because, for them, creating is like breathing, they have to do it? Artists create for all these reasons and more. Above all, great artists want to express something deeper than ordinary forms of communication, like talking or writing, can convey. They strive to suggest meanings that are beyond the reach of everyday vocabularies. So they invent visual vocabularies for people to interpret. Each person can read this picture language, which doesn't come with a dictionary, differently. This difference in the way each person reads a piece of art is especially true of art made in the past 500 years. Ancient as well as medieval art often had a communal purpose and a common language of symbols that was widely understood. Often that communal purpose was linked to religion, ritual, or mythology. Religion, ritual, and mythology. The earliest works of art, prehistoric cave paintings from 30,000 BC to 10,000 BC, were likely to have been a key part of a shamanistic ritual. In many prehistoric cultures, people thought religion and ritual helped them to control their environment or prepare for an afterlife. Art frequently had a role in these religious rituals. Scholars don't know much about the religion of prehistoric man. But they know a great deal about the religions of the earliest civilizations in Mesopotamia and Egypt. Some Mesopotamian art and most ancient Egyptian art have a religious theme. Egyptian art typically focuses on the afterlife and man's relationship with the gods. During the Roman period, religious art was less common than secular art. But religious art dominated the Middle Ages, lost some ground during the Humanistic Renaissance and Mannerist period, and made a comeback in the Baroque period during the religious wars between Catholics and Protestants. Politics and propaganda. The U.S. Constitution guarantees separation of church and state. But in many earlier civilizations, religion and politics were two sides of the same coin. Egyptian pharaohs, for example, viewed themselves as God's divine representatives on earth. Egyptian art was both religious and political. The notion of the divine right of kings, in which kings were supposedly appointed by God to rule on earth, is rooted in these ancient Egyptian practices. In ancient Greece, Pericles ordered and paid for the building of the Parthenon and other monuments to memorialize Athenian power and prestige. These works will live forever as a testament to our greatness, he said. Art was meant to glorify the state. Similarly, the Romans erected columns, such as Trajan's column, and triumphal arches, like the Arch of Constantine, to celebrate Roman victories and assert Roman power. In the early 19th century, the French Romantic painter Eugène Delacroix fired up people to fight for democracy with his painting Liberty Leading the People. When I say jump. Art made for patrons. A lot of art was commissioned by rich and powerful patrons to serve the patrons' purposes. Some of them commissioned religious works showing themselves kneeling beside a saint, perhaps to demonstrate their religious devotion and earn brownie points from God. Others commissioned works to celebrate themselves or their families, for example, Philip II of Spain paid Spanish painter Diego Velázquez to immortalize Phil's family during the Baroque period. Some patrons merely wanted to fatten their art collections and enhance their prestige, like Peter van Ruijven, who commissioned works from Johannes Vermeer in 17th-century Holland. Van Ruijven was one of the richest men in Delft and was Vermeer's primary patron. Personal vision. No one paid Vincent van Gogh to paint. In fact, he only sold one painting during his lifetime. Van Gogh was the classic starving artist, but he kept painting, driven by a personal vision that his public didn't share or understand. Many modern artists are also driven by a personal vision, a vision that offers the public a new way of looking at life. Typically, these artists have to struggle to communicate their vision and find an accepting public. Until they find that acceptance, many of them must eat and sleep in Van Gogh's shoes. Detecting design. Design is the arrangement of visual elements in a work of art. In this section, I show you how to recognize and interpret design elements in the art you see. Pattern. Pattern is as important in visual art as it is in music or dance. A song is a pattern of notes, a dance is a pattern of movement, and a painting is a pattern of colors, lines, shapes, lights, and shadows. Patterns give consistency and unity to works of art. Mixing a pretty floral pattern with a checkerboard design would be as inconsistent as pasting two types of wallpaper together. The key to pattern is consistency. That said, an artist may choose to intermingle several patterns to create contrast. Sometimes patterns in art are as easy to recognize as the designs in wallpaper, but more often, the patterns are complex. Like musical motifs in a Beethoven symphony or the intricate design in a Persian carpet or a rose window. Patterns may also be subtle, like the distribution of colors in Jacopo Pontormo's The Entombment. Rhythm. Visual art also has rhythm, like music. Although you can't tap your feet to it, a visual beat does make your eyes dance from hot color to cool color, from light to shadow, or from a wide wavy line to a straight one. Without varied visual rhythms, the artwork would be static. And your eyes would lock on one thing or fail to notice anything at all. Balance. Each part of a painting or relief has visual weight. The artist carefully distributes this weight to balance the work of art. Look at the visual weight distribution in Sandro Botticelli's Primavera. The two male figures on opposite ends of the painting balance it like bookends. Venus stands in the center, spreading love from left to right, to the trinity of graces and to the goddess Flora and nymph Chloris. If Botticelli had placed Flora, Chloris, and the graces on the same side of the painting, it would have been lopsided. Besides, Botticelli is telling two love stories in the same painting. Usually, the more symmetrical and balanced a work of art, the more likely it is that the piece of art depicts something godlike, important, or ideal, as in Leonardo da Vinci's The Last Supper. Contrast. The stiffness that balance can bring with it can be balance's biggest problem. For example, most Egyptian statues are so symmetrical that they seem rigid and unable to move. Art needs something to upset the scales a bit. Contrast can disrupt balance while preserving it, as in Polykleitos' Doryphorus or Spearbearer. The statue is balanced, but his limbs strain in opposite directions. The opposites, the cocked left knee and the cocked right arm, balance each other while creating contrast and tension. Contrast has other roles in art beyond disrupting and preserving balance. It creates interest and excitement. Artists can create contrast by offsetting wavy lines with straight lines or by juxtaposing organic shapes and geometric shapes. René Magritte created startling contrasts by placing a soft, curvaceous woman beside a boxy solid wall and a rock. The color of the wall and the woman's lower body are almost the same. But the wall is rough and rectangular and the woman is soft and curvy. That's contrast. Emphasis. Emphasis, something that stands out from the rest of the artwork, is important too. Artists can achieve emphasis with striking colors, contrast, or placement of a figure. Like the X that marks the spot on a map, emphasis draws the viewer's attention to what's unique and most important, to the treasure in the artwork. Sometimes artists achieve emphasis by sticking something odd or striking in the middle of a painting, or by painting a naked woman having a picnic with men in suits. Decoding meaning. Of course, art also conveys meaning. Sometimes it tells a story, sometimes it suggests meaning through symbolism and metaphor like a poem, and at other times meaning seems to swim inside the feeling you get from the art, kind of like it does in music. The ABCs of visual narrative. How do you know when an artist is telling a story? To decide whether a painting is a visual narrative, you should ask yourself 3 questions. Does the artwork suggest the passage of time? Does it seem to have a beginning and an end? Does it hint at something that happens outside of the picture frame? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, then the artist is probably telling a story. How do you read these stories? To read a narrative painting, you don't necessarily start at the left and move toward the right the way you read a book, although sometimes you do, as in the Bayeux Tapestry. Instead, you begin at the focal point. The focal point may be the beginning of the story, but it can also be the climax. The key is to look for relationships in the painting among people and between people and their surroundings. Is someone in love, broken-hearted, jealous, or vengeful? Is she at home in her world or alienated? Also ask yourself what happened to the person in the painting just before the moment depicted, what's happening at that moment, and what will happen next. Look for clues, like pointing figures, facial expressions, and meaningful gestures, as in Caravaggio's Calling of St. Matthew. Who or what is the person in the artwork looking at? Let his eyes lead your eyes. Sorting symbols. Symbolism is often a key part of visual narrative and even of portraits and still lifes. Understanding symbols helps you enter the world and situation of the painting. Without that understanding, you may miss much of an artist's message. For example, many observers believe that the meandering road in Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa symbolizes the path of life, or as the Beatles called it, the long and winding road. The skull in Franz Halse's Young Man with a Skull obviously symbolizes death, and the apple in Nicolas Poussin's The Holy Family on the Steps clearly suggests the Garden of Eden, even though there's no sign of Adam and Eve or the serpent. Chapter 3. The Major Artistic Periods and Movements. In this chapter, identifying the difference between a movement and a period. Exploring the main art periods, delving into the major art movements. Art history is divided into periods and movements. In this chapter, I take you chronologically through these divisions, giving you a quick reference description of the major ones. Understanding the differences between a period and a movement. Art movements and art periods represent the art of a group of artists over a specific time period. The difference between a period and a movement has to do with duration and intention. Art movements. An art movement is launched intentionally by a small group of artists who want to promote or provoke change. A movement is usually associated with an art style and often an ideology. Like the women's movement or the civil rights movement, an art movement may push for a new perspective on specific issues. For example, members of the movement may oppose war or a particular political system. Sometimes they write manifestos that spell out their goals and hold movement meetings. Typically, the artists in a movement hang out together and show their work in group exhibitions. Their art shares stylistic features and focuses on similar subjects. Art periods. An art period is usually not driven by conscious choice on the part of artists. Periods typically outlast movements and develop gradually due to widespread cultural or political pressures. Often, an art period is based on a parallel historical era. For example, early Christian art refers to art made during the early Christian era. The artists painted Christian subjects and shared a set of religious beliefs. But they didn't write manifestos or hold meetings in which they discussed ideology and stylistic guidelines. Art historians grouped their art together because they lived at the same time, painted similar subjects, and were driven by a similar spirit, the spirit of their religion, culture, and age. An overview of the major periods. An art period can last anywhere from 20,000 years to 50 years, depending on the rate of cultural change. Cave art began around 30,000 BC and ended with the Paleolithic period, or Old Stone Age, between 10,000 BC and 8,000 BC, depending on where you lived with respect to the receding Ice Age. In those days, culture changed about as fast as a glacier melts, and this was before global warming. The neoclassical period, on the other hand, only lasted about 65 years, from 1765 to 1830. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the rate of social and cultural change after the mid-18th century. Sometimes the distinction between a period and a movement is fuzzy. The High Renaissance, which some people call a subperiod within the 150-year Renaissance, and others call a movement, only lasted from 1495 to 1520 because two of the three principal High Renaissance artists died in 1519 and 1520. Mannerism, too, was once considered a period, but is now widely viewed as a movement that started in the mid-1520s with works by Rosso Fiorentino, Pontormo, and Parmigianino. The thing is, these artists didn't call themselves Mannerists. They thought their artfulness and style were just extensions of what Raphael and others would have done in the High Renaissance. Conscious or not, they inaugurated a manner of artwork, together with Michelangelo, that was stylistically different and became a movement. Prehistoric period. The prehistoric art period corresponds with the Old Stone Age and New Stone Age, when people used stone tools, survived by hunting and gathering or agriculture, and didn't know how to write. Although they couldn't write, Old and New Stone Agers definitely knew how to paint and sculpt. In the Old Stone Age, artists painted pictures of animals on cave walls and sculpted animal and human forms in stone. Their art seems to have been part of a magical or shamanistic ritual, an early form of visualization, to help them hunt. Even the act of painting was probably part of these rituals. Painting went downhill during the New Stone Age, despite the fact that they had better stone tools, herds of domesticated animals, and permanent year-round settlements. But architecture really got off the ground with massive tombs like Stonehenge, temples, and the first towns. Mesopotamian period. The Mesopotamian period covers several civilizations: the Sumerians, who invented writing and monotheistic religion; the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. Mesopotamian art is usually war art, propaganda art, or religious and tomb art. Though each civilization contributed different features to Mesopotamian culture, the warlike Assyrians developed visual narrative. For example, the art developed in the same region, and the different peoples who ruled the area influenced each other. Mesopotamian art is often macho, but also refined, and sometimes comic and highly imaginative. Egyptian period. Egyptian art could be called the art of the dead, because most Egyptian art was made for the tomb. The Egyptian style is symmetrical, rigid but elegant, for the most part unchanging, highly colorful, and symbolic. Egyptian artists also used visual narrative, but their picture stories were less dramatic and realistic than the art in Mesopotamia. Minoan, Ancient Greek, and Hellenistic art. Because of the conquests of Alexander the Great, 356 BC, 323 BC, and the later Roman love affair with Greek culture, the art produced in the city-states of ancient Greece spread from to the British Isles to India, changing the world forever. The earlier Minoans influenced Greek culture, but their achievements were small in comparison. Minoan period. Minoan culture and art had a short life compared to Egyptian and Mesopotamian art. Minoan art is playful and focuses on life, sport, religious rituals, and daily pleasures. It is the first art to truly celebrate day-to-day life. Ancient Greek period. Greek art is divided into the archaic and classical periods and moves increasingly toward realism. The Greeks invented techniques like red figure painting, the contrapposto pose, and perspective to allow artists to represent the world realistically. But as real-looking as classical Greek art is, it is also idealized. Greek statues don't have pot bellies, zits, or receding hairlines. Art of the classical period is known for its otherworldly calm and beauty. Hellenistic period. The Hellenistic period begins with Alexander the Great's death and ends with Cleopatra's snakebite suicide. It is Greek art stripped of much of its idealism. Most Hellenistic statues are still physically perfect, but instead of being imperturbably serene, they can express anger, bitter sorrow, or intense fear. The Hellenistic period was the first time these emotions were dramatically and realistically portrayed in art. Etruscan and Roman art. You could call Etruscan and Roman art copycat culture. Each borrowed extensively from the Greeks, but each contributed something of its own. Etruscan period. The Etruscans who lived in Etruria didn't leave much architecture behind them, and the Romans who conquered them built over most of their settlements. But the Romans didn't disturb Etruscan tombs. So we know Etruscan life mainly through their tomb art, which was a surprisingly happy affair, apparently. The early Etruscans viewed death as a pleasant continuation of life. Roman period. The Romans also copied the Greeks. But art historians don't call the Roman period a Greek replay. Like the Etruscans, the Romans didn't merely imitate, they added something to the Greek style. In architecture, the Romans contributed the Roman arch, an invention that helped them to build the biggest system of roads and aqueducts the world has ever seen. In painting and sculpture, the Romans took realism even farther than the Hellenistic Greeks. The busts of senators and early emperors look middle-aged, tough, and worldly. Byzantine and Islamic art. Byzantine art is Christian art of the Eastern Roman Empire after the fall of Rome in AD 476. Islamic art and architecture spread across the Near East, North Africa, and Spain following the wave of Islamic conquests between AD 632 and AD 732. Byzantine period. Byzantine art is a marriage of late Roman splendor, Greek artistic traditions, and Christian subject matter. Byzantine art is symbolic and less naturalistic than the Greek and Roman art that inspired it. It points to the hereafter rather than the here and now. The most popular form of painting in the Byzantine period was icon painting. Icons were used in prayer. Byzantine artists also liked to work in mosaic. Islamic period. Like Moses, Muhammad condemned graven images, so there aren't many representations of human beings in Islamic art. The Middle Eastern and North African countries that converted to Islam were also the guardians of the most sophisticated knowledge of mathematics and geometry. Some of this knowledge seems to have filtered into the artwork. Islamic artists often incorporate incredibly intricate and colorful patterns in carpets, manuscripts, ceramics, and architecture. Medieval period. Medieval art is mostly Christian art created in Europe after the fall of Rome and before the Renaissance. Its most familiar art forms are stained glass windows, illuminated manuscripts, silver and golden reliquaries, architectural reliefs, and Romanesque and towering Gothic cathedrals. Medieval art is steeped in mysticism and symbolism, with a focus on the Christian afterlife. Renaissance period. Renaissance means rebirth. In the Renaissance period, artists returned to classical models in painting, sculpture, and architecture. Christian religious art still dominated the market, but the stories and images in the art tended to celebrate man and things of this world. The rising value of the individual led to many portrait commissions, a genre that had become all but extinct in medieval art. With such a here and now focus, realism became as important as symbolism. To make paintings and sculptural reliefs look three-dimensional, Renaissance artists worked out the mathematical laws of perspective. High Renaissance. Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, and Raphael defined the movement known as the High Renaissance, even though their artwork sometimes looks very different from each other's. All three strove for perfection and often found it in stable, geometrically shaped compositions. The High Renaissance ideal is high because these three artists portrayed idealized subjects, even if the subject was a restless and youthful warrior like Michelangelo's immortal David. An aura of beauty and calm is the hallmark of High Renaissance art. Mannerism. After mastering nature, artists began to intentionally distort it. Mannerist artists elongated human figures, created contorted postures, and distorted landscapes, which were often charged with symbolism and erotic or spiritual energy. Art was no longer a window into an idealized version of the real world, but a window into the fruitful and fanciful imaginations of artists. Baroque and Rococo art. Baroque artists traded the geometrical composure of the Renaissance for drama that involved the viewer. Rococo art dropped the drama of Baroque art while taking its ornamental side to extremes. Baroque period. Baroque developed during the Counter-Reformation and became a propaganda weapon in the religious wars between Catholicism and Protestantism in the 16th and 17th centuries. The Catholic Church wanted art to have a direct and powerful emotional appeal that would grab the attention of ordinary people and bind them to the Catholic faith. Baroque cathedrals stuffed with dramatic sculptures and paintings filled the bill. In Protestant lands, Baroque artists went out of their way to downplay the importance of saints, preferring more symbolic subjects for moral painting like landscapes charged with meaning, genre scenes, pictures of everyday events that read like fables, and paintings of fruit that suggest the temporariness of life on earth. Kings and princes also enlisted Baroque artists to celebrate their wealth and power. Rococo period. Rococo is Baroque art on a binge. This was an art favored by kings, princes, and prelates who had too much money to spend. The ornamental quality of Rococo painting, relief, sculpture, and architecture is often more important than the subject matter. Neoclassicism and Romanticism. Neoclassicism and Romanticism occurred during the Enlightenment and the American, French, and Industrial Revolutions. In a sense, Neoclassicism and Romanticism were not only periods but movements. Some conscious choices were made by neoclassical and romantic artists. They chose their style of art usually to convey a political and/or spiritual message. Neoclassicism. Neoclassicism is yet another return to Greco-Roman classicism. It is a dignified art that depicts men and women of the period as if they were Greek gods and heroes. Their poses and often grandiose gestures are larger than life. Romanticism. Romantic artists shunned the Industrial Revolution, attacked the excesses of kings, and championed the rights of the individual. Some took refuge in nature, others sought an invigorating mixture of fear and awe in sublime landscapes and seascapes. Imagination with a capital I and nature with a capital N were the wellsprings of their unbridled creativity. An overview of the major movements. When the trend toward movements kicked in, periods pretty much got pushed out of the picture. Since the 19th century, the direction of art is no longer dictated by church or state, but by the artists themselves. Realism. Realists reasserted the integrity of the physical world by stripping it of what they viewed as romantic dreaminess or fuzziness. They painted life with a rugged honesty, or at least they claimed to. The Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And the Arts and Crafts Movement. In the mid-19th century, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood in England created an art designed to counter the negative effects of the Industrial Revolution, gritty cities, poverty, and so on. They rejected the materialistic society fed by the Industrial Revolution and backpedaled to the mysticism of the Middle Ages, often depicting Arthurian romances and other medieval legends in their paintings and stained glass windows. The Arts and Crafts Movement, founded by William Morris, one of the Pre-Raphaelites, preferred the hands-on medieval workshop to the sweatshops of capitalism. They favored handmade furniture and decorative arts produced in small workshops and artist colonies. Impressionism. The Impressionists painted slices of everyday life in natural light, people on a picnic, a walk in the park, an outdoor summer dance. But Impressionist art doesn't freeze life the way a classical painting does. Instead, by capturing the subtle changes of atmosphere and shifting light, Impressionist paintings convey the fleeting quality of life. Post-Impressionism. Post-Impressionism is not a movement, per se, but a classification of a group of diverse artists like Vincent van Gogh and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec who painted in the wake of Impressionism. Fauvism and Expressionism. Both of these early 20th century movements pushed art in the direction of abstraction by simplifying or distorting form and by using expressive rather than naturalistic colors. Fauvism. Fauvism was a short-lived movement headed by Henri Matisse and André Derain. The Fauve simplified form by stylizing it. They also flattened perspective, which made their paintings look less like windows into the world and more like wallpaper. The leading Fauve, Henri Matisse, believed that art should be inspiring and decorative, fun to look at. Fauve art does have a wallpaper appeal. It's art you could hang in a child's playroom, if your kid weren't clamoring for Big Bird and Elmo. Expressionism. Expressionism is two German movements, Die Bruck and der Blaue Reiter. Each of these movements had slightly different goals, but they employed similar techniques and painted similar subjects. Expressionist artists distort the exterior of people and places to express the interior. On an expressionist canvas, a scream distorts not just the face but the whole body. Similarly, the madness inside an insane asylum twists the architecture itself so that it, too, looks mad. Cubism and Futurism. Both Cubism and Futurism fractured physical reality into bite-size units, but for very different reasons. Cubism. Cubism could be called the artsy side of Einstein's theory of relativity. All is relative, what you see depends upon your point of view. Georges Braque and Pablo Picasso invented Cubism so people could observe all views of a person or an object at once, from any angle. Futurism. Unlike most art movements, instead of turning their backs on the machine age, the futurists embraced technology, speed, and, unfortunately, violence and fascism. They felt fascism was the only type of government that could carry out the cultural housecleaning they believed that society needed. Their movement was based mostly in Italy and pre-revolution Russia. Dada and Surrealism. World War I caused unprecedented destruction and misery in Europe. Disillusioned artists reacted by rejecting the traditional values and art forms of the culture that they believed triggered the war. Dada. The madness of World War I spawned Dada, which started in neutral Switzerland and quickly spread across Europe. Their art was to mock the prevailing culture, including mainstream art, with demonstrations, actions, and mock art. The Dadaists assumed that rational thinking had caused the war, therefore, the antidote to war must be irrational thinking. Surrealism. Surrealism was inspired by Dada and Freud's theories of the unconscious. Like the Dadaists, the Surrealists hoped to fix humanity by snubbing the rational world. But instead of mocking earlier art and art traditions like the Dadaists, they sought ways to get in touch with the deeper, instinctual reality of one's unconscious. They painted their dreams, practiced free association, and mixed up the rational order of life in their art by juxtaposing objects that don't normally or rationally fit together, a vacuum cleaner plugged into a tree, a locomotive driving out of a fireplace. A melting clock hanging from a dead tree branch. Suprematism, constructivism, and still, non-objective art. Fauvism, Cubism, Dada, and Surrealism freed artists to explore reality in non-traditional ways. The Suprematism, Constructivism, and still art movements sidestepped representational art completely, moving into the realm of pure abstraction, or non-objective art. Suprematism. The leader of Suprematism, Kazimir Malevich, strove to free feeling from form, disassociate it from representational art. He believed that photographic realism, like you see in the Mona Lisa, places a wall between the observer and the essential feeling that the artist is trying to express. He believed that most people only see the picture and don't experience the inner feeling. So he stripped away the representation or picture to liberate the feeling. Constructivism. Constructivist Russian artists refused to make art for galleries or museums. They wanted to create a practical art that ordinary workers could use and that represented the modern utopia that socialism was supposedly creating. De still. De still is artistic geometry, achieved with a few shapes and the primary colors, red, blue, and yellow, along with black and white. The head of the de still movement, Piet Mondrian, believed that there are two types of beauty, subjective and objective, which he considered universal and abstract. De still artists wanted to depict the objective type of beauty, so they avoided photographic representation because it awakens subjective feelings. Abstract Expressionism. After World War II, it was as if American artists dropped a bomb on German Expressionism, splattering the representational side of it and leaving only the naked expression. In German Expressionism, emotion distorted the face of reality. In Abstract Expressionism, emotion distorts the face of reality beyond all recognition. One of the most famous American abstract expressionists, Jackson Pollock, achieved this effect by throwing paint on his canvases. Pop art. In the early 60s, pop art artists decided to co-opt the new styles of advertising, the fantasies of stardom, and the hunger for ever-new stuff that characterizes post-World War II America. Their art is sometimes hard to distinguish from the movies and ads they borrowed from. Conceptual art, performance art, and feminist art, late 1960s. 1970s. In the late 1960s, the art world fractured into so many minor movements that tracking them all is difficult. In one of the most radical of these movements, artists believed that they didn't need to produce any artwork at all but simply generate concepts or ideas. In reality, this conceptual art, as it's known, is often a type of performance or a happening that can be very spontaneous and audience-driven. Sometimes it's simply writing on a wall. One early conceptual artist camped out with a coyote for a week in an art gallery to get people thinking about the treatment of Native Americans. Feminist art is linked with conceptual art in that it focuses on the inequalities faced by women and tries to provoke change. The movement has no set style. It might include a painting on canvas or a group of women dressed up in gorilla costumes crashing a public event to pass out pamphlets. Postmodernism. Postmodern means life after modernism. And modernism refers to art made between about 1890 and 1970. Postmodernist thinkers view contemporary society as a fragmented world that has no coherent center, no absolutes, no cultural baseline. But it is often built on the past, which has all these qualities in abundance. How do you capture the mosaic of the mixed-up postmodern world on canvas or in a building? Postmodernist artists and architects sometimes do it by borrowing from the past and by mixing old styles until they wind up with a new style that reflects contemporary society. Part 2. From Caves to Colosseum: Ancient Art. In this part, I fill you in on the first art galleries, the caves of prehistoric man, and the rituals behind their art. Then I dig up the past in ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia by excavating the meaning of tomb art and political and religious art. Next, I examine how ancient Greece and Rome invented the modern world. Chapter 4. Magical Hunters and Psychedelic Cave Artists. In this chapter, deciphering the world's oldest paintings cozying up to a Stone Age fertility symbol grappling with new Stone Age architecture like Stonehenge. During the last great ice age, a vast sheet of ice buried much of the world. In about 120,000 BC, Homo sapiens sapiens appeared on this frozen stage. They've stolen the show ever since. Humans shared the scene with herds of woolly mammoths, woolly rhinos, aurochs, saber-toothed cats, bison, horses, and deer, which roamed much of the planet. The first humans survived in this glacial land as nomadic hunter-gatherers. We don't know much about them because they left no written records, no art, and no permanent settlements. The earliest surviving art came into the picture about 90,000 years later in the Paleolithic period, or Old Stone Age, which lasted roughly from 40,000 BC to 8,000 BC. This primitive art was already highly developed in 30,000 BC, at the peak of its game, as if the prehistoric artists who made it studied their craft in some Stone Age art school. More likely, their skills were handed down from master to apprentice and honed over thousands of years. They painted their masterful depictions of wild animals in the world's first art galleries, the walls of caves primarily in southern France and northern Spain. Their pictures of woolly mammoths, holy rhinos, and aurochs are the most accurate images we have of these extinct species. In this chapter, I introduce you to the earliest artists. Those who lived in the Stone Age and New Stone Age. Tools and art, a critical connection. Before humans could make art, they had to be able to make tools. Apes use sticks as tools to knock down bananas, for example, but they don't produce tools. Our earliest ancestors got onto their feet about 4 million years ago. We don't know what they did with their hands until 2 million years later, when the first primitive tools appeared in East Central Africa. These tools were simply stones with sharpened edges made by our ancestors Homo habilis. Tools were slowly refined over the millennia from handyman's rough flaked stones used for cutting meat and pelts to the invention of the hand axe and the spear. The bow and arrow were invented around 10,000 BC. Our forebears were slowly learning to master their environment, and art was just around the corner. Cool cave art or Paleolithic painting, why keep it a secret? Prehistoric artists hid their paintings deep within the bowels of caves as if they were meant to be kept secret. The paintings are so well hidden, in fact, that the first discovery of a cave painting didn't occur until 1879 in Altamira, Spain. The second discovery took place in 1940 in Lascaux in Dordogne, France. Two little boys followed their lost dog into a hole that opened into the ancient cave. Figure 41, the superbly rendered cave paintings of prehistoric sea animals in Altamira, Spain, were the first to be discovered. Courtesy of Spanish National Tourist Office. Hunting on a wall. Initially, researchers believed cave art was connected to hunting. Hunting was primitive man's main job, and the paintings are mostly of animals, with the exception of a few human stick figures, handprints, and geometric patterns in some caves. Did primitive man believe that capturing an animal's likeness on a wall with paint made it easier to kill the animal in the wild? If so, then primitive painting was probably a type of sympathetic magic, kind of like voodoo. The idea is, if you paint a picture of a creature, then you have power over it. In some cave paintings, spears and arrows seem to pierce the animals. If you wanted to kill lots of bulls, you painted lots of bulls on the walls of your cave. In the Lascaux Cave, the roughly 65-foot-long cave gallery known today as the Great Hall of the Bulls could be an example of a large-scale, prehistoric magic ritual. But today researchers suspect that cave art was more than just hunting magic. Feathers, fur, and chewed sticks, prehistoric art tools. Cave artists used feathers, fur, moss, chewed sticks, and their fingers as paintbrushes. Sometimes they incised the outlines of pictures into cave walls with sharp stones or charcoal sticks. They ground minerals like red and yellow ochre, manganese, and hematite into red, violet, yellow, brown, and black powders, which they applied directly to the damp limestone walls to create painted fur for bears and bison, and spots for leopards and hyenas. Today, 15,000 to 25,000 years later, this primitive paint still hasn't peeled. Prehistoric artists also spray painted their pictures to cover larger areas more efficiently by blowing colored powders through hollowed-out reeds or bones. Some of these hollow tubes have been discovered in the caves with traces of color still in them. Cave painters sometimes used bumps and crevices on cave walls to emphasize an animal's contours, a bulge for a belly, an indentation for an eye, a bump for a hump. In the Chauvet Cave in southwestern France, an artist painted a bear's paw over a knob in the wall, making it appear more threatening, as if the animal were reaching into real space to claw somebody. 10,000 years later, cave artists at the Altamira, Spain, cave used the same technique, painting the burly bodies of bison over swellings on the cave's ceiling, giving the herd a sculpted, three-dimensional look. Psychedelic shamans with paintbrushes. Later researchers discovered that the animals that appeared on old Stone Age dinner menus showed up least in cave art. Many paintings depict predators like panthers, lions, and hyenas, not typical dinner fare and not easy to hunt. These researchers offered a new theory based on the fact that hunter-gatherer societies from Africa to Siberia and North America practiced shaman magic. Prehistoric hunter-gatherers probably did the same thing. Hollywood portrays shamans as witch doctors, but a tribal shaman is more than a spellcasting, dancing doctor in a Halloween costume. He's a visionary and sometimes an artist. Primitive peoples believed that the shaman could beam up into the spirit world to talk to the souls of beasts. They even thought he could learn from animal spirits how to fix imbalances in nature. Some shamans appear to have used natural hallucinogens to give them a boost into the sixth dimension. Primitive peoples throughout the world often depict shaman journeys with hallucinogenic images of humans and animals entwining and even merging. Cave art might depict these journeys, too. Are cave paintings the world's first psychedelic art? The half-human, half-animal cave paintings, such as the bird-headed man with bison and rhinoceros on the wall at Lascaux, suggest they are. At first glance, Bird-headed man with bison looks like a typical hunting scene. A hunter spears a bison in the belly. The beast's entrails spill out of him. But why does the prone man beside the animal have a bird's head? And why is a bird perched on a nearby pole like a totem? In 19th century Siberia, shamans used a so-called world pole, topped by a bird to launch their voyages into the underworld. The Lascaux bird-headed man and bird-topped pole may have been meant to give a prehistoric shaman a successful send-off into the spirit world. Trainee shamans had to undergo ceremonial, fake deaths, as well as food and sleep deprivation. Maybe the prone figure is a trainee shaman, faking death after a long fast and a couple of all-nighters. Flirting with fertility goddesses. Sculpture grew up alongside painting as a sister art. Most prehistoric sculptures were either small statues called statuettes or reliefs. In a relief, the sculptor outlines an image in stone or wood, and then carves out the background so that the image projects above it. The most famous early statuette is the Woman of Willendorf, also known as Venus of Willendorf. All nude female figures found by German archaeologists in the 19th century were named Venus. Woman of Willendorf is a pudgy 41 2-inch high figure carved out of limestone. She doesn't look very sexy to modern eyes, but she may have been a fertility symbol 25,000 years ago. Does this mean that cavemen thought that Woman of Willendorf was hot stuff, the Marilyn Monroe of her day? Because concentric braids of hair wrapped around her head like a stocking cap conceal Woman of Willendorf's face, we can surmise that her looks didn't matter. She wasn't an individual, but a type. What mattered were her sexual characteristics: huge breasts, a bulging belly, watermelon-sized buttocks, and prominent genitals. Her other features weren't given much attention by the artist. Her pudgy arms and cut-off legs seem to be an afterthought. The same female type is found in many prehistoric cultures around the world. So what was the purpose of this type of figure and what was her appeal? Was Woman of Willendorf meant to turn people on? Probably not. More likely, her purpose was to promote fertility and abundance. A woman might have held the statuette in her hand before having sex so that the statuette's fertility could be magically transferred to her. But why is Woman of Willendorf so fat? Her ample proportions may have been a sign of wealth. Living off nuts, berries, and wild game didn't make primitive people chubby. Many primitive people probably died of malnutrition, only a few reached the age of 30. And only a very privileged woman could afford to be this big. Dominoes for Druids, Stonehenge, menhirs, and Neolithic architecture. Technological progress followed the melting glaciers. As the land warmed up, man was able to farm it, domesticate animals, improve his stone tools, and build permanent settlements. He was no longer dependent on hunting and gathering for survival. Historians call this period the Neolithic Age or New Stone Age. It began in the warm southern climes and migrated northward in the wake of the retreating glaciers. With improved technology, cave life and cave art became a thing of the past. Artistically, mankind fell into a creative slump that lasted about 6,000 years. He still made art, but it doesn't compare to the old Stone Age cave paintings and carvings. However, during the New Stone Age, men improved as architects and built structures to last. In this section, we check out New Stone Age architecture from Anatolia to the British Isles. Living in the New Stone Age. Catalhoyuk and Skara Brae. One of the oldest New Stone Age settlements was at Catalhoyuk in Anatolia. It thrived from around 6500 BC to 5650 BC. Interestingly, the people of Catalhoyuk appear to have had no fortifications or war. Gods, they seem to have been a truly peaceful people. They mastered textiles, basketry, and simple pottery, and built rectangular, mud brick homes with doors in the roofs. Each house had 2 or more elevated, multi-purpose platforms, one of which was always painted red. The platforms served as a table, workbench, bed, and bier. Some of the rooms in Catalhoyuk homes included paintings and sculptures. Catalhoyuk paintings frequently feature stick-form men who are usually hunting. Hardly any women appear in the paintings. But the female figure shows up in Catalhoyuk sculptures with woman of Willendorf features and dimensions, apparently as a fertility symbol or Earth Mother. In Skara Brae, a later Neolithic community in the northerly Orkney Islands of Scotland, the homes included a fireplace, stone tanks, and built-in stone furniture. The only art we have from Skara Brae are the simple designs carved into the stone pottery and some of the stone beds. Cracking the mystery of the megaliths and menhirs. The most interesting examples of New Stone Age architecture are the mysterious megaliths of Brittany and England. A megalithic structure is a simple or complex arrangement of stones. Some appear to be stark, open-air temples built by mammoth-sized men. Others look like graveyards with hundreds of headstones sprouting out of the earth. In fact, some megalith structures did serve as tombs, either for one person or several people. Many megalithic tombs look like giant stone tables with two uprights supporting a massive horizontal slab laid across them. This arrangement is called a post and lintel system. The post and lintel system is one of man's first architectural advances. Sometimes the tombs are covered with small rocks and dirt, forming a grave mound over the horizontal. Topless megaliths, solitary upright slabs, are called menhirs. Prehistoric peoples scattered fields of menhirs throughout Brittany in western France between 4250 BC and 3750 BC. Menhirs appear in two types of formations, circular patterns known as cromlechs and cemetery-like rows called alignments. Despite their appearance, alignments weren't graveyards. They appear to have been astronomical observatories and sites for sun worship. The largest alignment is in Carnac, Brittany, where 3,000 menhirs stand in 2-mile-long rows. The menhirs appear to gradually grow as you move from east to west. Stones on the eastern side are 3 feet high, while on the western end they're over 13 feet high. The alignment corresponds to the rising and setting sun. Today, no one knows how this prehistoric observatory worked. The greatest megalithic structure is the circle of stone slabs known as Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain of England. Stonehenge was built between 2550 BC and 1600 BC in at least 4 stages. It was once believed to be a Druid temple. We now think that this elaborate network of stones was used to predict solstices and eclipses, vital knowledge for people dependent on the growing season. From a distance, Stonehenge looks like an unfinished dominoes game played by giants. On closer inspection, it consists of a series of concentric circles and circular shapes, an inner horseshoe of 5 sets of gray sandstone groups in a post and lintel arrangement, and an outer circle of 20-foot-high gray sandstones, called sarsen stones, topped by lintels. Each sarsen stone weighs up to 50 tons. The lintels are connected, forming a continuous circle. A roughly 1,000-foot trench and embankment encircle the megaliths. This arrangement of circles within circles still mystifies people today. Until 1500 BC, a circle of bluestones stood between the sarsen stones and the horseshoe. The only available bluestone comes from Wales, 150 miles away. Stonehenge builders believed that bluestone possessed special properties, probably magical ones, otherwise, they wouldn't have hauled them such a long distance. In 1500 BC, the last generation of Stonehenge builders moved the bluestones inside the horseshoe. Researchers today have no idea why. Prehistoric builders also smoothed the inside faces of the stone posts and lintels and tapered the posts at the top so that the bellies or midsections of the posts appear to bulge. Even more impressive, they drilled holes in the lintels and cut cone-shaped pegs into the posts so that the posts and lintels would fit together snugly in a mortise and tenon joint. The designers also curved the outer lintels so each would form an arc, enhancing the circular appearance of the outer ring. So what's the purpose of this elaborate network of massive stones? Was it a temple, a place of human sacrifice, or a stone calendar? The function of Stonehenge is still a mystery, but recent investigations show that it could have been used to accurately predict the phases of the moon, solstices, and eclipses. Chapter 5. Fickle Gods, Warrior Art, and the Birth of Writing, Mesopotamian Art. In this chapter, Exploring the skyscrapers of the ancient world, eyeballing Sumerian sculpture and graven images, seeing through propaganda art, reading the first visual narratives, hanging out in Babylon. And Terah took Abram his son. And they went forth from Ur of the Chaldees, to go into the land of Canaan. Genesis 11 verse 31. Abraham, the father of the Jewish religion, was an Iraqi. Sort of. According to the Bible, he was born in Ur, one of the world's first cities, which was located in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq. But in those days, that part of Mesopotamia was called Sumer. So Abraham was actually a Sumerian, or more specifically an Urian. Historians don't know when Abraham left Ur, but until about 2334 BC, Ur was an independent city-state. Sumer was not really a country, but a cluster of city-states. Like ancient Greece. Sumer included Ur, Uruk, Eridu, Larsa, and about 8 other cities in southern Mesopotamia. Although linked by culture, religion, and the fact that they shared the world's first written language, the city-states didn't unite for over 1,000 years. Nevertheless, Sumerians called their patchwork country the land of the civilized lords, which makes it sound like they had some pretty uncivilized neighbors. They also called themselves the black-headed people. Sumer was a land of firsts. The Sumerian patriarch Abraham founded monotheism, and the Sumerians invented writing. They also created the first epic poem, Gilgamesh, and the earliest codes of laws, the most famous being the Code of Hammurabi. Archaeologists even found the oldest will in Sumer. It's about 5,500 years old. The Sumerians seem to have made the first potter's wheel, too. What an inventive people. Mesopotamia, which means between rivers in Greek, is bounded by the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, which fertilize it throughout the year. For this reason, it is also known as the Fertile Crescent. Some archaeologists believe that this fertile belt of land, where fruits and grains once flourished in natural abundance, was the biblical Garden of Eden. Geography was good to Mesopotamia's farmers, but not to its rulers. Unlike Egypt, which is surrounded by natural defenses, deserts on the east and west and the Mediterranean Sea on the north, Mesopotamia had no mountains, deserts, or oceans to protect it. It was easy to conquer and hard to hold on to. The Sumerians, uncivilized neighbors, desert-tough nomadic tribes, must have been irresistibly attracted to this flowering oasis. Power changed hands in Mesopotamia over and over during the 3,000 years in which the pharaohs maintained a fairly steady hold on Egypt. The art of both civilizations tells the story of their governments. Egypt was stable and so was its art, which hardly changed in 3,000 years. Mesopotamia's art changed almost as often as its rulers, each conqueror bringing new influences. In this chapter, I examine the art and architecture of the Sumerians, the Akkadians, Assyrians, Babylonians, and New Babylonians. Although each people had a distinctive style, these styles seemed to grow out of each other like a family tree of art and architecture, and in this chapter, I lay it all out for you. Climbing toward the clouds, Sumerian architecture. Each Sumerian city-state had its local god, who owned and protected the city. Priest-kings ran the city-states, acting as the gods' appointed shepherds of the people. They managed everything from the economy and government to religious affairs. They distributed the food, too, because even people's labor was viewed as God's property. Zigzagging to heaven, ziggurats. And they said, "Go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven." Genesis 11 verse 4. The Sumerians tried to get physically close to God with their architecture. Because their gods lived in the sky, they built their temples like high-rises. Sumerian architects achieved this skyscraper height with ziggurats, which look like tiered wedding cakes up to 7 layers high. The temples sat on top, close to God. The biblical Tower of Babel was probably a ziggurat. Because the Sumerians didn't have access to limestone, like the Egyptians, they built their ziggurats, temples, and palaces out of mud brick, which has a much shorter half-life than limestone or granite. As Genesis 11 verse 3 says, "And they had brick for stone, and slime had they for mortar." Most Sumerian architecture has disappeared, and gauging the original grandeur of it from the ruins left behind is difficult. However, the epic Gilgamesh gives a brief description of the glittering beauty of a Sumerian temple in Uruk. He built Uruk. He built the keeping place of Anu and Ishtar. The outer wall shines in the sun like brightest copper, the inner wall is beyond the imagining of kings. Study the brickwork, study the fortification, climb the great ancient staircase to the terrace, study how it is made, from the terrace see the planted and fallow fields, the ponds and orchards. This is Uruk, the city of Gilgamesh. Ziggurats included long staircases, ascending from terrace to terrace, climbing toward heaven and the Sumerian pantheon. But only priests were allowed to use the stairs and enter the temple at the top. All that remains of the ziggurat of King Ur-Nammu of Ur is the first floor, but it's enough to show the impressive architectural and engineering skills of the ancient Sumerians. The Tower of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar II, king of Babylon, gave ziggurats a bad rap by stealing holy objects from the temple in Jerusalem and housing them in the ziggurat of Babylon. He probably wanted to show that his gods had more power than the Hebrew God did. According to Chronicles 236:7, Nebuchadnezzar also carried of the vessels of the house of the Lord to Babylon, and put them in his temple at Babylon. To the captive Jews, Babylon's mountain-high ziggurat must have symbolized Nebuchadnezzar's overweening pride. But in general, the Sumerian and Babylonian peoples built ziggurats to put them in touch with the gods, not to elevate their personal egos. The eyes have it, scoping out Sumerian sculpture. The Sumerians had lots of gods, a sun god named Shamash, Enlil, the god of the wind, Anu, the king of gods, and Ishtar, the goddess of desire, to name a few. Each city also had a local god who acted as its spokesman in the assembly of the gods, kind of like a senator in the United States. As spokesperson, the local god made sure the leading gods granted special privileges to his town. People could petition their local god indirectly by going through the priest-king, or they could do it more directly by commissioning a statue of themselves and placing it in the temple. Worshipping graven images. Like most gods, Sumerian divinities lived somewhere in the sky or mountains. They also resided inside their statues in the temples of each city-state. In Sumer, a statue of a god wasn't just a representation, as it was later on in Greece, it was the god. Divinities could be in more than one place at a time. Statues could also be stand-ins for ordinary citizens. That is, if a Sumerian commissioned a statue, part of him or her took up residence in the statue, like a home away from home. For this reason, Sumerians placed statues of themselves in temples where they could interact with the statue of the local god. Stare down with God, statuettes from Abu Temple. People place statues in temples to commune directly with God, as in the Abu Temple statuettes. Are they bug-eyed aliens or did ancient Sumerians really look like this? The statuettes are called votive statues, because they represented real Sumerians who devoted themselves to, or made a vow to, their local god. Okay, but why are they bug-eyed? In horror movies, people's eyes bulge cartoonishly when they see a ghost. The ancient Sumerians' eyes popped when they saw a god. Being bug-eyed meant you were devout, it showed that you were awestruck in God's presence and that you couldn't take your eyes off of him or her. Of course, the denizens of Tel Asmar didn't really look like this, though the clothes, beards, and hairdos are certainly on target. Tel Asmar was a small town and their sculptors weren't as polished, so to speak, as big city artists in Ur and Uruk. Compare the Abu Temple statuettes to the sensitively rendered mask of a god from Uruk carved approximately 1,000 years earlier, about the time the Sumerians invented writing. The mask's eyes were most likely filled with colored stones, the eyebrows and hair were probably wrought of gold or copper, which is now missing. Figure 51. The female head of a goddess from Uruk was carved between 3500 BC and 3000 BC. Bildarkiv Prusischer Kulturbesitz Art Resource, New York. Early Egyptian statues seem squared off and rectangular, but Sumerian statues appear cylindrical. In fact, Sumerian artists based the human body on the cylinder and cone. Cone-like. Skirts flare out on the Abu Temple statuettes, most of which are men. Their legs are cylinders, and their braids look like vacuum cleaner hoses. Staircase-like beards distinguish most of the men. Playing Pwabi's lyre. When a Sumerian king or queen died, he or she didn't go to the grave alone. More than 60 soldiers, attendants, and musicians accompanied King Abarji of Ur into the tomb. Some of these grave guests wore helmets and carried spears to protect the king from any afterlife dangers, others bore musical instruments to perform for him, and a few drove wagons, which were pulled by teams of oxen. The oxen's remains were also found in the grave. More than 20 attendants joined Queen Pwabi in her nearby tomb, including 3 soldiers with drawn copper daggers and 10 well-dressed women buried in 2 rows facing each other. Whether these tomb groupies committed mass suicide or soldiers simply slew them, historians don't know. We do know that working for a Sumerian ruler was a demanding job. Figure 52, the design on the front of Pwabi's lyre illustrates 4 ancient fables. Plaque from the lyre from UR, University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology. The exquisite decoration that adorns Pwabi's lyre shows that UR artists were master craftsmen. A golden bull's head protrudes from the harp, which stands in for the bull's body. His blue-tipped horns, mat of blue hair, baby blue eyes, and curlicue blue beard are made of lapis lazuli, an azure or deep blue gemstone. The closest source of lapis was 2,000 miles away in Afghanistan. Obviously, trade flourished in 3rd millennium Asia. Under the bull's beard are a strip of animal fables wrought with wood and shell and inlaid in bitumen, a mineral pitch made from coal or oil. But who is the bull with the blue-tipped horns? In the top fable, a naked macho man hugs 2 bulls as though they were old-school chums. The bull's faces practically mirror the man's, and their right legs and hooves wrap about his head like parentheses. This image, common in Mesopotamian art, is sometimes called the Gilgamesh motif. In the Sumerian epic Gilgamesh, Gilgamesh and his friend Enkidu wrestle and slay the bull of heaven, whose horns are also made of lapis lazuli, like the bull's head on the lyre. The 3 other bands under the Gilgamesh motif tell a visual story or perhaps a series of fables invented long before Aesop. A lion, bear, wolf, deer, donkey, gazelle, and scorpion man serve food and beverages or play instruments like the humanoid animals in Disney cartoons. Some of these scenes must have seemed comic even then, like the ass playing the lyre or the wolf and lion waiters bearing food and drink for a feast. Ironically, the wolf, who wears a knife in his belt, carries a wolf's head on a platter, which he apparently just dressed for dinner. We can only guess at the meaning today, ponder what appear to be ironies, and enjoy the craftsmanship of artists who lived 4.5 millennia before us. Unraveling the Standard of UR. The Standard of UR depicts a Sumerian military victory fought in about 2600 BC. The artist tells the story of the battle and aftermath with inlaid images on 3 parallel strips on both sides of a wooden box. The front focuses on battle scenes, the back on the peaceful aftermath. The king is the big guy in the middle of the top band, examining naked prisoners who file before him. The lower strips show the battle itself. Apparently, this visual narrative should be read from bottom to top, because the battle is in full swing in the bottom register, and the king collects prisoners in the top band. Figure 53, the Standard of UR, measuring 81.2 inches high by 191.2 inches long, is a wooden box inlaid with shell, lapis lazuli, and red limestone. No one knows how it was used. This is the war side. British Museum Art Resource, New York. Figure 54, this is the peace side of the Standard of UR. Eric Lessing Art Resource, New York. Notice how the artist overlaps the wild asses pulling the chariots in the top and bottom bands of the war side. And notice how awkwardly he illustrates the dead men trampled by the animals in the bottom strip. The peace side depicts what must be an after-the-battle banquet. Reading again from the bottom up, men convey what may be battle booty to the feast. In the middle band, the food and gift parade continues. The top strip shows the banquet, people eating and drinking before the king while an entertainer plays a lyre. Despite all the activity, the Standard of UR is static, frozen in time. 1,000 years later, in northern Mesopotamia, the Assyrians dramatically improved visual narrative, giving it an action movie feel. Stalking stone warriors, Akkadian art. In about 2334 BC, a powerful king finally united Mesopotamia. But he wasn't Sumerian. Sargon I, an Akkadian king from an area north of Sumer, conquered Mesopotamia, northern Syria, and possibly part of Anatolia, creating one of the first empires. Now the devout Sumerians had a new kind of leader who put politics before religion. Under Sargon, art became a propaganda tool or another gear in his war machine. He used it to promote his ambitions rather than to honor the gods. Yet Sargon and his Akkadian successors still respected the Sumer religion. Sargon's daughter even became a priestess of Nana, the moon god of Uar. But Sargon replaced the Sumerian language with Akkadian. Sumerian culture was on the way out, though it had a brief rebirth before finally fizzling. An example of Sargon's new art is the head of an Akkadian ruler from Nineveh. The king is depicted as a godlike but secular ruler. He appears calm but with a seething battle-ready energy behind his imposing features. The style is similar to Sumerian sculpture. The artist coiffed the beard like those of the statuettes of Abu Temple, but the modeling of the face is much more realistic and brilliantly executed, especially the superb contours of the lips and slightly hooked nose. Stamped in stone, Hammurabi's Code. The Akkadian Empire lasted about 2 centuries, until tribes from the northeast overran it in 2112 BC. Ur-Nammu, the Sumerian king of Uar, which had remained independent, ejected them about 50 years later and reunited Mesopotamia for another century. Until a new wave of conquerors swept the Sumerian kings away forever. These centuries of turmoil produced no great art. Finally, in 1792 BC, Babylon emerged as a great political and cultural power in southern Mesopotamia, under King Hammurabi, its greatest and most famous ruler. Art and Sumerian culture resurfaced. Hammurabi respected the Sumerian gods so much that he created a code of divinely ordained laws, the first detailed written law code in history, to help carry out their moral commands on earth. He wrote the code in cuneiform, the Sumerian script. Like Moses, Hammurabi claimed to receive his law code directly from God. On the stele, Hammurabi meets the sun god Shamash, not on his knees like Moses, but standing, eye to eye with God. Under the image, Hammurabi writes a powerful introduction to the laws. Anu and Bel called by name me, Hammurabi, the exalted prince, who feared God, to bring about the rule of righteousness in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evildoers, so that the strong should not harm the weak, so that I should rule over the black-headed people like Shamash, and enlighten the land, to further the well-being of mankind. Hammurabi's law code prevented judges from arbitrarily handing down sentences based on personal bias. Nevertheless, many of the laws seem brutal to modern ears. If a son strike his father, his hand shall be hewn off. If anyone steal cattle or sheep or an ass, or a pig or a goat, if it belong to a god or to the court, the thief shall pay 30-fold. If they belong to a freed man of the king he shall pay 10-fold. If the thief has nothing with which to pay he shall be put to death. If a man knock out the teeth of his equal, his teeth shall be knocked out. In spite of its occasional severity, Hammurabi's code was the beginning of civil rights or, as the U.S. Declaration of Independence calls them, inalienable rights. Hammurabi must have known that writing the code in stone would make the laws seem immutable. Unlocking Assyrian art. In 1596, about 100 years after the death of Hammurabi, the Hittites conquered Babylon. They produced no great art. Not long after, the Kassites overran Babylon. About the same time, in northern Mesopotamia, the brutal Assyrians grew from a city-state called Assur into a vast empire that lasted from about 1363 BC to 612 BC, when the Persians and Scythians overran them. With their iron weapons, they terrorized their neighbors and mercilessly destroyed all challengers. The Assyrians created a macho art that glorified their rulers and intimidated their enemies. Each Assyrian king built a bigger than his predecessor's palace to flaunt his power. 5-legged creatures called lamassu with mile-long beards guard the gates of the citadel of Sargon II. The 5th leg makes the creature appear to be striding when viewed from the side, while from the front the lamassu appears to stand firm. More important, to convey their military exploits and staged hunting expeditions, the Assyrians gave visual narrative an action movie feel by inventing continuous visual narration. In other words, their picture stories read like a film strip with one event leading dramatically to the next. To appreciate this Assyrian contribution, compare an Assyrian storytelling relief to the standard of UR. The victory that the standard of UR describes is told in chunks. Discrete strips. Not only does the story get stuck at the end of each band, but the events within the band have no dramatic momentum, one action does not propel the next. The Assyrian relief of King Ashurnasirpal II killing lions is cinematic and royals with dynamic energy. You can feel the lion's awesome power as he leaps at the king, and you pity the dying lion under the horse's hooves who has been shot a few moments earlier. Notice that rank is no longer indicated by physical size but by action. Figure 55, King Ashurnasir. Pala killing lions captures the tense action of a lion hunt. British Library Hip Art Resource, New York. Babylon has a baby, New Babylon. After the Persians and their allies sacked the Assyrian capital Nineveh, Babylon re-emerged as the center of Mesopotamian culture. Nabopolassar, a Babylonian general who had sided with the Persians, became the first king of New Babylon. Although the kingdom only lasted for 70 years, its beauty and culture have become legendary, especially as they flowered under the reign of Nabopolassar's famous son, Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is best known for a present he supposedly gave his wife, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the original wonders of the world. But the Hanging Gardens didn't hang. They were terraced, rooftop gardens, irrigated by water pumped from the Euphrates. To visitors, it must have seemed as though an oasis had blossomed on the rooftops of Babylon. The kings of New Babylon returned to the Sumerian model of being shepherds of the people. Although Nebuchadnezzar attacked Judah, the New Babylonians were much less warlike than the Assyrians. New Babylonian art reflected this quieter and gentler period. It was much less aggressive and less active than Assyrian art. Nebuchadnezzar rebuilt Babylon into the most beautiful city on earth. One of his greatest architectural achievements is the Ishtar Gate, the gorgeous entrance to the city. The animals in the Ishtar Gate look like ornaments. On the front, against a background of glazed blue bricks, stand decorative horses, blue-horned bulls, and dragons made of gold-colored, turquoise, and blue bricks. The top of the gate is crenellated like a medieval castle. But instead of squares, the crenellations rise like mini ziggurats. What's the difference between the Ishtar Gate and Assyrian art? In the Ishtar Gate, all the animals strike the same pose, there is no movement. But the Ishtar Gate wasn't intended to tell a story. It was meant to be beautiful and imposing, a reflection of Nebuchadnezzar's cultivated tastes. The stiffness of the animals adds to this impression. Action would take away from the solemn majesty of the goddess's gate. Chapter 6. 1 Foot in the Tomb, Ancient Egyptian Art. In this chapter, reading one of the oldest historical documents in the world. Sizing up the pyramids. Exploring the art of Egyptian tombs, reading a book of the dead. Understanding why Egyptian statues are so colossal. The mountain-high pyramids and stony stare of the great Sphinx have awed mankind for thousands of years. The ancient Greek historian Herodotus wrote, "There is no country that possesses so many wonders, nor any that has such a number of works which defy description." The Roman leaders Julius Caesar and Mark Antony were so impressed by Egyptian culture and wealth that they had to first marry Egypt and then rule it. The mystique of ancient Egypt still captivates modern man. But today Egypt's biggest draw isn't the pyramids or Cleopatra, but Egyptian mummies, magic, and tomb art. Mummies and the magical resurrection rituals painted on the walls of tombs and coffins have inspired witches. Spells, short stories, movies, documentaries, art historians, archaeologists, and even the fashion industry. The film companies of the world have unreeled more than 90 mummy movies since the dawn of cinema, from a French short in 1899 about Cleopatra's mummy to Hollywood's The Mummy in 1999 and the made-for-TV The Curse of King Tut's Tomb in 2006. The Three Stooges even got into the act with We Want Our Mummy in 1939 and their more mature work, Mummies Dummies, in 1965. Mummies, Medicine, and Magic. Mummies have teased people's imaginations since at least the Middle Ages when people believed they had healing powers. 12th century doctors prescribed mummy dust for wounds and bruises, and until around 1500 people ingested mummy powder to relieve upset stomachs. Even in the 17th century. Witches. Like those depicted in Shakespeare's Macbeth, used mummies to help them forecast the future. Ancient Egypt 101. The discovery of King Tut's tomb in 1922 made front-page news and spawned an Egyptian fashion craze. Women forgot their distaste for bugs and put on scarab beetle jewelry, donned pharaoh blouses with hieroglyphic prints, and carried golden pyramid and sphinx-shaped ladies' compacts. Napoleon triggered the global fascination with Egypt in 1798 when he led the first major scientific expedition there, while trying to conquer Egypt and Syria. Egyptology has been almost a cult science ever since. In the 3rd century BC, an Egyptian priest named Manetho catalogued Egypt's ancient rulers into 31 dynasties. Today, historians still use his list, which begins in about 3100 BC with the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt and ends with Alexander the Great's conquest of Egypt in 332 BC. The 4th through 20th dynasties are divided by modern historians into 3 kingdoms, the Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, and New Kingdom, each with its own distinct features, as well as 2 intermediate periods bracketing the Middle Kingdom. Anything between the New Stone Age and the First Dynasty is called pre-dynastic. Table 6:1 Ancient Egyptian Historical Periods Period. Dynasty Date. The Nile River was the lifeline of ancient Egypt. Without it, the most durable civilization in history couldn't have survived. Herodotus said Egypt is the gift of the river. He was right. The Nile's annual summer floods fertilized the land around it, which otherwise would be desert. Most Egyptian cities and tombs hug the banks of the Nile like children clinging to their mother. If you venture too far from the river, you end up in the desert like Moses did. The ancient Egyptians believed the Nile's life-giving floods, which occurred during the hottest and driest part of summer, were the gods' gift because they didn't appear to be caused by the weather. The rain that swells the Nile actually falls hundreds of miles away in Ethiopia in the tributary called the Blue Nile, but before the advent of the Weather Channel, the floods in Egypt appeared to arrive miraculously. The Palette of Narmer and the unification of Egypt. During the pre-dynastic period, the tribes of Lower and Upper Egypt gradually formed into 2 separate nations, which were united at the dawn of history in about 3100 BC, possibly by Narmer, the first pharaoh of the First Dynasty. Mummification. Because Egyptians believed the Ka reunited with the body in the tomb, the body had to be painstakingly preserved through mummification. Mummification consists of 3 basic steps. 1. Remove the body's organs, preserving the important ones in jars. 2. Dry the corpse. 3. Wrap the body with layers of linen bandages. Embalming priests extracted the organs through a slit in the stomach, dried the body for 70 days with natron, and then bandaged it up. Incense, jewels, and herbs were often laid between the layers of bandages or mummy clothes. The Palette of Narmer is a 2-sided work of art. On one side, Narmer wears the white, bowling pin crown of Upper Egypt, on the other side, he wears the red, hatchet-shaped crown of Lower Egypt. The artist made Narmer at least 2 times bigger than the people around him to show his superiority and divine status. Pharaohs were considered gods in ancient Egypt. Figure 61, the Palette of Narmer chronicles a victory of King Narmer over his enemies. Here, the pharaoh clobbers a kneeling enemy. Werner Forman Art Resource, New York. Post-unification pharaohs usually wore a double crown, combining the white crown of Upper Egypt and the red crown of Lower Egypt. The symbols of Lower Egypt are papyrus, which grows abundantly in the Nile Delta, and the cobra. Those of Upper Egypt are the lotus and the vulture. Though it seems like backwards thinking, Upper Egypt is lower on the map than Lower Egypt, that is, Upper Egypt is geographically south of Lower Egypt. How did that happen? Unlike the Tigris, Euphrates, and Mississippi rivers, the Nile flows from south to north, which is a downhill trek from its source at Lake Victoria in Central Africa to the Mediterranean Sea. Figure 62. Check out the pharaoh looking at his decapitate the enemies who have been stacked with their lopped heads between their legs. Werner Foreman Art Resource, New York. Discovered in Hierakonpolis, the ancient capital of Upper Egypt, the Palette of Narmer is perhaps the world's oldest historical document, dating from around 3100 BC. It resembles the small palettes on which Egyptians ground the pigments for their eye makeup, but seems far too big to have actually been used for that purpose. The reliefs on both sides of the green siltstone tell the story of the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt in horizontal bands, kind of like a comic strip. There's even some helpful text in hieroglyphics, the picture language of ancient Egypt. We can't read every part of the palette, but we can interpret a lot of it. The hieroglyph for Narmer's name, a catfish perched on a chisel, appears at the top on both sides. Clearly Narmer, the big guy on the palette, is the main character in the story. Notice that a pair of cow heads in the top strip set off Narmer's hieroglyph, like bookends. Hathor, the motherly cow goddess, is often viewed as the mother of pharaohs. Placing Narmer's name between images of Hathor suggests his divine origin. On one side, the pharaoh clobbers a kneeling enemy. The victim resembles the two sprawling, naked guys in the bottom band. Apparently, they've already been clobbered and are now worms' meat. When Moses meets God in the Old Testament, the first thing God tells him to do is take off his shoes. Here, Narmer is also shoeless. A servant behind Narmer carries the pharaoh's sandals. Is there a connection? Why does Narmer have to remove his shoes to clobber somebody? Perhaps because slaughtering defeated enemies was viewed as a religious ritual because the divine pharaoh was always right. Also, like Moses, Pharaoh is in the company of a god, in this case, Horus, the hawk god hovering over him. Horus, the god of war and light, is sometimes depicted as a man with a hawk's head and other times simply as a hawk. Here he is represented as a hawk with one claw and one human arm with which he debrains an enemy who is attached to a bouquet of papyrus plants. The fact that the hawk stands atop papyrus plants, the symbol of Lower Egypt, shows that Lower Egypt has been subdued. Also, Horus's action parallels the pharaoh's and indicates that Narmer's deeds are in harmony with the gods. On the flip side of the palette of Narmer, Narmer, identified by his size and by the hieroglyphic name tag next to his head, is shoeless again. So he's probably performing another religious act, inspecting decapitated enemies who have been stacked with their lopped heads between their legs. A priest and pharaoh's standard bearers march before him. Their respective heights suggest their rank. On the next lower strip, two snake-necked lionesses face off. Their entwined necks and perfect symmetry may suggest the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt, and that both halves of Egypt are equal. Note that two of the pharaohs' men restrain the lionesses, implying that the two Egypts need to be governed by a strong hand, Narmer's. In the bottom band, a bull trumps Egypt's enemies, while knocking down a fortress with his tusks. Bulls were often used to depict the might of Pharaoh. Both sides of the palette paint a picture of Egypt's strength and unity under the divine rule of Narmer. The Egyptian style. Though it's a very early work, the palette of Narmer is representative of all later Egyptian art. The Egyptian style, once established, hardly ever changed. Notice that part of the pharaoh is shown in profile, while the rest of him is represented in frontal view. In 3,000 years of Egyptian art, the pharaoh never changes his pose. The pharaoh's legs are always shown in profile, with the flat left foot planted in front of the right. The chest and shoulders are in frontal view, while the face is in profile. Egyptian artists were ultra-conservative, probably because the main purpose of art was religious, and the Egyptian religion didn't change much, not until the reign of Akhenaten in the New Kingdom. All artists followed a canon of proportions when representing the human figure, sizing a man with an 18-unit grid. The unit could be based on a man's shoe size or his fist. The knees, belly button, elbows, and shoulders had to be a specified number of units from the feet. This is why Egyptian royals look so much alike. The pharaoh was considered perfect and unchanging, like a god, therefore, his proportions had to be unchanging in art, regardless of the king's actual dimensions. Only the lower ranks could be shown in more realistic poses, like the men harnessing the lionesses in the Palette of Narmer, whom you see from strict profile in more naturalistic positions. Artists used the same canon of proportions to sculpt statues, but the figure was depicted frontally rather than in partial profile. Also, the left leg of the statue steps forward, more so in men than women, as in the statues of King Menkora and his queen from the 4th dynasty. Despite their stoic faces, notice the intimacy and sculptural harmony of the pair. They look like they were made for each other. King Menkora and his queen, who seem as durable as the pyramids, represent the stability of the Old Kingdom. Excavating Old Kingdom architecture. Old Kingdom pharaohs ruled Egypt like gods on earth. Their power and financial resources must have seemed limitless and are best represented by the Great Pyramids and mighty Sphinx of Giza, who has the body of a lion and the head of Khafre, the 4th pharaoh of the 4th dynasty. Even after 4.5 millennia of dust storms, the majestic 65-foot-high Sphinx still stares boldly at the world. The pyramids grew in steps, literally. They began with small mastabas, which seemed to grow with the prestige of the pharaohs during the 1st and 2nd dynasties. A mastaba is a mud brick rectangular slab with doors and windows. It included a morning room for visiting relatives and a sealed chamber for the deceased person's soul. The mastaba was attached to an underground tomb by a long shaft cut into rock. During the 3rd dynasty, stone stairways to heaven called step pyramids were erected over the mastabas to ensure their permanence and give kingly tombs a grander appearance. The greatest is the step pyramid of King Djoser, the 2nd king of the 3rd dynasty. Until about 2690 BC, Egyptians used primarily mud brick, wood, and reeds to build mastabas and temples. The first totally stone structure was King Djoser's step pyramid, which was raised in the necropolis at Saqqara, just south of modern-day Cairo. Erecting the first all-stone structure took an innovative mind, someone with the vision to break with tradition and think outside the box, or, in this case, mud brick mastaba. Imhotep, whose name appears at the base of a tomb statue of Djoser in the step pyramid, was just that. He is the first known artist and architect in history and was referred to as the Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, the first after the King of Upper Egypt, Administrator of the Great Palace, Hereditary Lord, the High Priest of Heliopolis, Imhotep, the Builder, the Sculptor, Woodcarver. He was also a famous physician and magician. In late Egypt, Imhotep was viewed as the god of medicine and healing and had shrines in parts of Egypt and Nubia. Imhotep's step pyramid is similar to a Mesopotamian ziggurat. It seems to be a spiritual launch pad, designed to give the pharaoh's soul a boost into heaven, one step at a time. In the 4th dynasty, the step pyramid evolved into the familiar four-sided pyramid like the Great Pyramids at Giza. The oldest and biggest of the Great Pyramids, completed in about 2560 BC, was erected by Khufu, who ruled Egypt between about 2589 BC and 2566 BC. Khufu's pyramid took roughly 20 years to build, stands 450 feet high, and is built on a 13-acre square base. Originally the pyramid stood at 481 feet, but its polished limestone veneer, which added about 30 feet to its height, has deteriorated. The sides of the pyramid are equilateral triangles that face due north, south, east, and west. They are aligned perfectly to 1/10 of a degree to the cardinal points on a compass. The pyramid is part of a vast funerary complex that includes 2 mortuary temples, 3 smaller pyramids for Khufu's wives, another small pyramid for Khufu's mother, a causeway, and mastabas for nobles linked to the pharaoh. The pyramid shape duplicates the sun's rays streaming through an opening in a cloud. Because Egyptians believed that a deceased pharaoh rode to heaven on the sun god's rays, the perfect pyramid may have been designed to facilitate his skyward ascent in a more refined fashion than the step pyramid. The Rosetta Stone. In 1799, one of Napoleon's officers, Captain Pierre-François Bouchard, discovered the Rosetta Stone, which was dated 196 B. c. In the port city of Rosetta. An important decree was inscribed on the stone in two languages, Egyptian and Greek, so everybody would understand it, like Canadian road signs that are written in both French and English. One of the languages, Egyptian, was expressed in two different scripts. One of the scripts, hieroglyphics, was the sacred writing that Egyptian priests used. The other, Demotic, was the common people's script. Starting in the 8th century BC, Greek was the language of the foreigners who ran the country. The key was to find common ground between the three scripts. About 20 years after the Rosetta